Now the first person is doing something you've probably done yourself. They start performing extra kindness, over-explaining, bringing up unrelated topics to test the water, apologizing for something they're not even sure they did. Watch closely because this is the moment the power shifts. The silent partner hasn't asked for any of this. They haven't demanded an apology. They haven't listed grievances. They just stop participating. And the other person is now working overtime alone, trying to repair a rupture whose exact size and shape they can't see. That's the second mechanism. Silence outsources the emotional labor entirely. In a normal conflict, both people are responsible for resolving it. In a silent treatment dynamic, one person goes still, and the other person becomes responsible for reading minds, managing feelings, negotiating peace, and eventually apologizing, sometimes for things they never actually did. And this is where most people misunderstand what's happening. They think, they must really be hurt if they're this upset. But hurt people usually want resolution. They want to be heard. What's happening here often isn't about being heard at all. It's about being watched. Watched scrambling, watched trying, watched squirming under the weight of not knowing. That discomfort you feel isn't a side effect. In manipulative uses of silence, it's the actual goal. There's a third layer underneath all of this, and it's the one that makes the pattern so hard to see while you're inside it. Silence rewrites who holds the power in the relationship without either person ever naming it out loud. Think about status for a second. In any interaction, the person who seems least affected, least needy, most in control of their own emotions, tends to hold the higher position. Calm reads as strength. Visible desperation reads as weakness. The silent person, by saying nothing, appears composed, even serene, while the other person becomes increasingly anxious, apologetic, small. One person looks unbothered. The other looks like they're falling apart over nothing. And nobody said a word to create that imbalance. The silence did it by itself. This is why the silent treatment can feel so much worse than an argument, even to people who consider themselves confident and secure. An argument is a fight between equals. Someone yells back, and eventually there's a resolution, even an ugly one. The silent treatment isn't a fight. It's a freeze. And freezes don't resolve, they just wait for someone to break first. Which brings us to the part almost nobody talks about. The person on the receiving end almost always breaks first, and it's not because they're weak. It's because human connection is a biological need, not a preference. We are wired, from infancy, to seek proximity and response from the people we're attached to. A baby who cries and gets no response doesn't just stop needing comfort. The need intensifies, then eventually the baby goes quiet too, not from peace but from a kind of shutdown. Adults do a version of the same thing. When someone we're emotionally attached to withdraws, our nervous system doesn't interpret it as, give them space. It interprets it as a threat to the bond itself. That's why the silent treatment can trigger a response completely out of proportion to the actual offense. Your body isn't reacting to a missed phone call. It's reacting to something much older, the fear of being cut off from someone you depend on. Now here's the part that separates the two versions of silence I mentioned earlier, because the difference matters enormously. Someone who needs space because they're overwhelmed will usually tell you that, even briefly. I need a minute, I don't want to say something I regret. They come back within a reasonable time. When they do return, they're willing to actually talk about what happened. The silence has a beginning and an end, and it's in service of a real conversation later, not a replacement for one. The manipulative version looks different once you know what to look for. There's no explanation given, and if you ask for one, you get vague deflection. You know what you did, or, if you don't understand, I'm not going to explain it. The silence doesn't have a clear endpoint. It lasts exactly as long as it takes for the other person to apologize, plead, or offer something, attention, gifts, extra affection, that restores the silent person's sense of control. And here's the giveaway that most people miss. Once the apology comes, the underlying issue is rarely actually discussed. The silence just lifts. Warmth returns. Everything goes back to normal without anything being resolved, which means the same pattern is now primed to repeat the next time there's a disagreement. Notice what that teaches the other person over time, session after session. It teaches them that expressing a need, disagreeing, or setting a boundary results in being cut off emotionally, and that the way to end that pain is to give in, over-apologize, or stop bringing up their own needs altogether. This is how the pattern escalates without either person consciously deciding to escalate it. The silences don't need to get longer. They just need to keep working. And each time they work, the person on the receiving end becomes a little more cautious, a little more accommodating, a little more afraid of the quiet. Some people who use silence this way aren't even fully aware they're doing it strategically. It might have started as genuine hurt years ago, and only over time did they notice, even unconsciously, that pulling away got them exactly what they wanted. Apologies, attention, control over the emotional temperature of the relationship, without ever having to explain themselves or be challenged. That's an uncomfortable idea, because it means the behavior isn't always a calculated performance. Sometimes it's a habit that quietly rewards itself. But intention isn't actually the most useful thing to focus on if you're the one on the receiving end. What matters is impact and pattern. So here's what to actually watch for in real situations, not as a checklist to run through, but as a feeling you can learn to notice. Ask yourself, after this person goes quiet, do you find yourself apologizing even when you're not sure what for? Does the silence come with no explanation, and does asking for one get treated as another offense? Does the ending of the silence depend entirely on you doing something, reaching out, complimenting them, giving in, rather than on an actual conversation happening? And maybe most tellingly, does this happen specifically after you've expressed a need, said no to something, or brought up a problem with their behavior? If withdrawal consistently follows the moments you assert yourself, that's not a coincidence. That's a pattern with a function. Compare that to healthier space. Healthy space still has some form of communication in it, even if brief. It has a rough sense of when it'll end. And crucially, it leads somewhere, an actual conversation where both people get to speak, not a silent negotiation where only one person's discomfort is allowed to exist. If you recognize the harmful pattern, the instinct is usually to try harder, be more understanding, apologize more thoroughly, figure out exactly what set them off so it never happens again. That instinct is understandable, but it feeds the exact dynamic that's hurting you. What actually interrupts the pattern is refusing to perform. Not matching their silence with your own coldness, that just turns it into a standoff. But calmly naming what's happening out loud without begging. Something as simple as, I notice you've gone quiet. I'm here when you're ready to talk about it, but I'm not going to guess. And then, difficult as it is, going and living your life. Not performing calm. Actually returning your attention to yourself. That single shift removes the entire engine of the dynamic, because the engine was never really the silence itself. It was your reaction to the silence. Once you stop chasing, apologizing on command, and treating every withdrawal as evidence of your own guilt, the silence stops being a lever anyone can pull. It just becomes what it should have been from the start, one person's mood, not a referendum on your worth. And that's really the discovery hiding underneath this whole pattern. The silent treatment was never actually about the missing words. It was about what your mind does when there are no words to hold on to. The other person doesn't have to convince you that you're wrong. Your own uncertainty does that work for them. Which means the moment you stop needing their voice to know your own worth, the silence loses its grip. The room stays quiet either way. But it stops being a threat and starts being just a room.